Thank you, Sally, and thank you for your own work in 15 Now, without which we couldn't have achieved it. And thank you all, my sisters and brothers, for being here. I'm really honored to be able to speak in front of you, and I also thank all the esteemed speakers who came before me. I have a little bit of time to talk to you, and I thought we could start with just having a brief overview of what has happened as a fallout of the Affordable Care Act. And then I think we have to ask the most important question: why didn't we win single-payer health care when we were all mobilized to win, to fight for it? And obviously that analysis has to lead to the next question: what can we do to fight back? And I'm really glad that Sally has framed this part of the conversation on the basis of 15 Now, because I think it holds a lot of lessons for us, general lessons for how to carry out a struggle for social justice. And if time permits, I would like to end by taking a global look at what is happening in general, but particularly for healthcare, because I think that our agenda of social justice, while primarily has to be geared towards winning single payer in the United States, also has to be informed by the understanding that these reforms have been fought for in other places. You know, we had other speakers talk about other industrialized countries that have better healthcare systems, but what is happening to those systems is something that we have to think about, and that, in my opinion, as a socialist, leads to larger systemic questions. So I wanted to start by, in terms of the assessment of what has happened with Obamacare, by a quote from the National Nurses United, and I'm quoting from their March 2014, their most latest journal, National Nurse. It says, according to most reliable estimates, more than 30 million Americans will remain completely uninsured under this act, and many millions more will be underinsured as they enroll in lower-cost plans that leave them vulnerable to high deductibles and other out-of-pocket costs. And I think many physicians from PNHP have articulated really well our problem of not only people being uninsured, but the people who have insurance in name also being part of that segment that is suffering, and those are the underinsured, and that's pretty much everyone. And I'm sure you all recall Michael Moore's film Sicko, in which he starts by talking about people who are not insured, and then he says this film is not about those who are not insured. This film is about people who have insurance on paper and what happens with the for-profit insurance. And going on about Obamacare, obviously there are some positive aspects, but it leaves most of the healthcare coverage in the hands of the employers, and it has strengthened the hands of private health insurance in administering coverage and setting prices and setting the terms for doctors and the hospitals providing care. And I need hardly tell you, many of you who are physicians and healthcare providers, what impact it has had. The US is still leading the world, in terms of, especially in the industrialized world, in preventable death, infant mortality, maternal mortality. One of the speakers, I was struck by a previous talk that I had attended by the PNHP, in which the speaker, Dr. Andy Coates, who I'm going to quote again later on, who said that if you look at simple measures of welfare in terms of health, how good is the quality of life, he talked about hearing aids. Hearing aids, given the technological advancement of human society today, costs next to nothing. And yet the provision of hearing aids is so difficult under our system. And it's not a commentary on how difficult it is to manufacture hearing aids, because it takes nothing. This is a question of political analysis. What is happening politically in our system? Why is it so difficult in the wealthiest country in the history of humanity that people who need hearing aids don't have access to them? And obviously I'm using that as just one example. The list is practically endless. But I wanted to highlight some really key things about the consequences of not having single-payer healthcare. And I think our discussion should be formulated not on the basis of whether or not the ACA delivered something good. Maybe it did, but that's not the point. The point is, what are we not getting from it, and why didn't we win single-payer healthcare? That's what I would like to focus on. But just very quickly, we had a great white paper from the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, who talked about how multi-employer healthcare plans have, for over 65 years, provided really good quality healthcare to a lot of unionized workers. There's been that history. And despite all their lobbying of the Democrats, they did not, and despite Obama's promise, the unions did not get what they were looking for, and the law is going to end up forcing millions out of multi-employer plans because small businesses are exempt from the tax on employees that do not provide healthcare benefits under the law, if we don't do something about it, that is. Let's also look, just some statistics at the extent and the spectacular growth of for-profit care. 52% of hospice care is in private hands. 77% of nursing homes are in private hands. 92% of dialysis centers, private, and 100% of freestanding lab image places in private hands. This is not a publicly provided healthcare by any means. The racial divide persists horrendously. The excess deaths, if you look at the excess deaths of the black community, more than 83,000 fewer black people could have died in 2000 if the racial gap had been eliminated, and the more recent studies are showing that that racial gap is persisting. I also thought it would be important for us to mention the recent Hobby Lobby case in Supreme Court. How could we talk about healthcare without talking about what has happened, the brutal attacks on women's reproductive rights? And in her scathing dissent, Justice Ginsburg said, the cost of an intrauterine device is nearly equivalent to a month's full-time pay for workers getting the minimum wage. And we have to frame this discussion not only in terms of the Supreme Court and the fact that there are conservative members in the Supreme Court. Of course, that is true. But had we won single-payer healthcare, this would not have happened. Single-payer healthcare is the only framework that guarantees affordable reproductive rights to women. And if we don't have a program that provides that for women, then this is not a country in the 21st century. That's right. Woo! And we also have to talk about the ongoing challenges in providing healthcare to the trans community. We need a guaranteed, publicly provided, affordable healthcare program such that the trans community members can go to any doctor and can never be denied healthcare. We cannot talk about healthcare as a human right unless we are talking about including everybody. So let's go on to the question of why didn't we win single-payer healthcare. Dr. Caper said he listed some of the things that we face as barriers. What are the barriers? He talked about apathy. He talked about how the political formulation pits one group of people against the other. That is all true. However, I think that we have to understand the American psyche much more clearly than we are than the narrative that we are handed down by corporate media. Single payer, or more generally, the idea of publicly provided healthcare and the idea of healthcare as a human right has always been popular among Americans. If you go to fair.org, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, they will show you a whole range of opinion polls, not just on healthcare, but every possible social justice issue. And if you look at the polls right from the Truman era, they will show you that the American public is well to the left of what the media will have you believe, and the American public is certainly well to the left of the US Congress. You have to understand, it's a strange thing for me as an immigrant from India to be having to convince Americans that you're on the left. Don't believe the things they say about your own thinking. You are on. But I also have numbers here. A New York Times CBS poll from early 2009, this was when the public battle was raging, showed that the public preferred, by over 60%, public preferred a single-payer-like system over a privatized system. The public mandate exists, my sisters and brothers. That is not the barrier. The barrier in the battle for $15 an hour was not the public mandate. The public mandate kept growing with every new poll that was done. So what is it that is stopping us? I wanted to start, that analysis, to talk about the political strategies by mentioning how in 2009, and even leading up to 2009, the National AFL-CIO put all this effort, resources and foot soldiers into lobbying Congress for HR 676, Medicare for all, in the hope that this was going to happen under Obama. But what actually happened? Let's take, let's have a record of what happened. From the very beginning, the Republican strategists went on the offensive. The insurance lobby opposed the reform, even when it was obvious that it would enrich them, and there is a strategy behind why they did that too. They went around denouncing, what they called government-run insurance. Obviously, Fox News ran amok. They described it as un-American, socialist, treacherous. They were right about the socialist part. It wasn't, but it's not treacherous, unless you are the pharmaceutical corporation CEO, in which case you would find it treacherous. They organized. The Republican Party and the right wing systematically organized grassroots campaigns. They dominated town hall meetings many times, not always. Their message, which was reactionary and at times plainly racist, was heard loud and clear. And of course, the media played an incendiary role in this. And we all have this experience from campaigning in the state of Washington. Some of you I met during that time. And I remember, even if there was just one single person at a town hall or at a protest that was against single-payer healthcare, the media would just play that nonstop. And if you were at home and all you had to rely on was a TV news report, you would think that the rally was just full of anti-single-payer activists. So obviously the media played a big role. But what did the Democrats do? And when I say Democrats, please understand that I mean the Democratic Party establishment. There is any number of ordinary working people who consider themselves Democrats or Democratic Party supporters whose values I share with as a socialist. I used to be a Democratic Party supporter until I gave up. Until I gave it up. Until I gave it up as a failed strategy. I teach statistics, among other things, in college, and in statistics, obviously, stats 101, if a hypothesis fails repeatedly, what do? You reject the hypothesis. You don't try to find more and more data sets that will fit the hypothesis. You try to find a different explanation. And so what happened with the Democratic Party? They controlled both the legislative and executive branches. They allowed the Republicans to dictate the agenda. Single-payer advocates were kept away from the discourse. The insurance industry representatives were given prominent seats at the table. I'm obviously not telling you something that you don't already know. If the insurance industry, and this is where the strategy part comes, if the insurance industry had embraced any of Obama's proposals right away publicly and called off their bitter campaign of resistance, then what would have happened? They would have allowed proponents of real change, of real single payer, enough room, some vacuum to organize and strike back. And they were very smart. The only way, they knew that the only way to avoid that was to keep the single payer side on the defensive by denouncing even the most moderate change. That was the lay of the land at that time. And that strategy worked wonderfully. The louder their voice, the more the leaders of the Democratic Party were trying to appease them. And this is where the question of counter strategy comes in. If the Republican Party and the right wing and the corporations go on an offensive like that, what is the correct counter response? What is the correct counter strategy that is going to give you success? It is not what the Democrats did, obviously. What they did was they went on appeasing them more and more. They did, unfortunately, they did what they always do best. They silenced their left flank and kept moving the agenda to the right. And most of the progressives in the Democratic Party folded one by one, abandoning single payer or even the most meager public option. As you all recall, the last man standing was Dennis Kucinich, who flipped 2 days before the vote after Obama personally appealed to the voters in his district. Obama had no concessions to offer to the progressive side, but he got their vote. And from the Republicans, he failed to secure a single vote despite all the concessions. And so the Democrats managed, once again, to single-handedly pass legislation tailored to the needs of big business, much like the stimulus package of 2009, the bailout of 2008, and the credit card industry reform of 2010. And so the question here is not a question of morality or or the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Of course, we know there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans. The question is for us, as activists, what is our strategy going to be? Are we going to continue endlessly putting our eggs in the Democratic Party basket, or are we going to fight back in a much more challenging and defiant manner, having learned our Stats 101 lesson that this strategy of lobbying the Democratic Party and allowing them to water down everything that we fight for in relation to what they face with the Republican Party. Are we going to just continue doing that, or are we going to have an alternate strategy? David mentioned mass movements. I thought that was one of the most important phrases that has come up in our discussion so far. Of course, without mass movements, none of this is going to be possible. But we have to remember that in 2009, 2010, we did have a mass mobilization. We had a lot of activists out on the streets campaigning for single-payer healthcare. There were many who I personally met who were, young people who were getting active, politically active for the first time around that issue, because they had seen somebody among their family or close connections having suffered miserably because of the lack of real health care, and which, that just propelled their passion into that movement. So we did have mass mobilizations at that time, but we have to remember from that lesson that the mass mobilizations need strategies that will ensure us success. And that's where I hope that we can bring in the discussion of the $15 an hour movement. But before we do that, I think it's also important to mention some of the wonderful work that has been done all around the country by advocates for single-payer healthcare. Advocates for single-payer healthcare haven't admitted, defeated, and gone back. Obviously, that's exactly why we are here to discuss what we can do. The developments in Vermont are definitely worth mentioning, but I also agree with the description of the challenges that are being faced there. And we also have to make a mention of the valiant protests by nurses, by the California Nurses Association, and the NNU has played a fantastic role in this debate. But where do we go from here? Congressmember McDermott said that I think we're going to be able to win in 2017. I respectfully ask, why? How? What has changed? What is going to be different about the Democratic Party in 2017 that was not true in 2009? Why would they give it to us now as opposed to then? I don't think that anything has changed in the Democratic Party establishment except that they are watching what we're doing in Seattle. And so should we. We should be learning from our own success of the $15 an hour struggle in Seattle to understand what it is that worked. So what did we do in the $15 an hour struggle? How did that come about? Obviously, as many of you know, one of the starting points of placing $15 an hour as a concrete demand to build a movement around didn't happen overnight. It was, it's something that has to be tested, and then you have to have a feel for it. You have to have a sense that this is going to gain ground. This is going to capture the imagination of a large number of people. Obviously, as a socialist, I certainly don't believe that $15 an hour is enough. As an economist, I certainly don't believe it's enough. With a full-time job, it's only $30,000 per year. That is not enough to live on in Seattle, and those of you who live here will know what I mean. However, winning social reforms, making progress, winning progressive reforms is a question of how to bring out all the anger and the hunger for change into an organized manner, which is what we call mass movement. That is what a mass movement is. But for a mass movement to come together, which means that individuals have to be drawn in to a political struggle, we need a concrete political demand around which they can rally. Single-payer healthcare has that quality. It's a really viable, sharp, and wonderful political demand that we could build a movement around. We could rebuild that movement. But $15 an hour was exactly like that. But it had to be examined. So one of the most important steps that happened was fast food workers walking out. And I think one of the first walkouts was in Manhattan, just a week shy of Thanksgiving in 2012. That year, Socialist Alternative had run our first electoral campaign. We're activists, but we don't shy away from electoral struggle. We had run our first electoral campaign against House Speaker Frank Chop. And we ran an openly socialist campaign. Our ballot said Socialist Alternative Party. And we ran an unabashedly working class campaign. We called for statewide single-payer healthcare. We called for rent control, affordable housing, and full funding for mass transit and education by passing a millionaire tax and ending corporate subsidies. And when we started our campaign, everybody told us, we're on your side, but there is no hope for this campaign. And of course, we didn't win, because otherwise I would have been in the State House. But we still won. We ran an openly socialist campaign. We took no money from corporations. We did not curry favor. We did not curry favor with the political establishment. And let's name the names here, right? In Seattle, Republicans are virtually a non-entity. So when I say political establishment, I obviously mean the Democratic Party establishment. And even so, we won 29% of the vote, which was 20,000 people voting for an open socialist, taking no money from corporations, and a socialist whose name they couldn't pronounce. I'm facetious only in the aid of my more important political point, which is that none of those things mattered, because when people are hungry for a genuine alternative that is going to fight for them, going to appeal to their desire for social justice, then those labels don't matter. And in fact, not only was the label socialist not a barrier, people came up to me and said, if you believe in all these things and you're a socialist, maybe I need to read some of your literature. Maybe I'm a socialist, because it doesn't seem all that bad of an idea. But at that time, and the reason I mentioned that was our campaign had wound down, and we heard about the protests in New York, and the walkouts by fast food workers, by McDonald's workers, walked out with the demand of 15 and a union. And there was something that happened at that moment. I remember that we just felt $15 an hour is going to be the demand that people are going to be rallying around. And that is precisely what happened. Come 2013, we launched our Socialist alternative campaign for city council, and at the same time, the labor movement went into struggle for $15 an hour at CTAC. A lot of these movement-like factors coalesced, somewhat coincidentally, somewhat consciously, but that is what we needed in order for this change to happen. And when we ran our campaign last year for city council, we had a very interesting development that happened. We had a group of people who are Democratic Party supporters who launched a Democrats for Sawant group because they have been fed up with relying on the Democratic Party establishment to carry out the values that they support them for, and they are hungry for a change. And that was one of the beginnings of the $15 struggle. After we won the election, which was, as you all remember, it was an unfolding drama in some ways, we quickly launched the 15 Now grassroots campaign. And as Sally Soriano correctly said, $15 an hour was being ignored by the political establishment of this city for the longest time. Roughly a month and a half before election day, election night, Ed Murray, who was at that time Senator Ed Murray, declared that he was going to be in support of $15 an hour, which was a very important development, and I welcomed that. But the reason it happened was not because the Democratic Party establishment was leading on this issue. Workers and ordinary people and activists led on this issue, and that is why the political establishment had no choice but to adopt that agenda. And the public mandate in this city came to a point where it was unviable for anybody running a political campaign, an electoral campaign, to not support $15 an hour. That is how we put pressure on the political establishment, not by lobbying them into perpetuity, but by challenging them defiantly and saying, we want to do this. Whether you like it or not, we are fed up with our falling standards of living. We are fed up with this misery that is inflicted on us, and we want a change to happen. If you don't want to be part of that agenda, that's your choice. And I think that that's the sort of defiance that we need in the single-payer struggle as well. And for those who might tell you that this is a divisive strategy, be courageous and tell them it's absolutely the most uniting strategy, because we are bringing all the working people together under one banner in order to fight for social reform. It is divisive towards big business and corporations, but it needs to be that, and I will never apologize for that. They will always tell you that you need to build coalitions. Of course you need to build coalitions. The question is not whether you need coalitions. Anybody who is even minimally politically savvy will know that you need to build coalitions, otherwise you're irrelevant. But the question is, whom are you building coalitions with? Right? Are you building coalitions with those of us who are permanently voiceless, to bring them into the political struggle, to engage them so that they will join this fight for their own rights? Or are we going to continue to build coalitions, or the so-called coalitions, with big business, with corporate interests? That is the question that we have to ask. And I think that question is relevant whether we are talking about a minimum wage issue, or a rent control issue, or a single-payer issue. Obviously, the details of strategy making and tactics will differ based on what demand you're talking about, which place and which time. But let us be willing to draw the general lessons of what Seattle has shown, what the Seattle working class has shown. That we need, for the working class to break from this two-party system, we need a real push for building mass movements, but through those mass movements, creating our own leaders, having our own voices, running for office. I will say that the best way to ensure success, or to build for the success of single-payer healthcare in these statewide strategies that we are talking about, that Jeff Johnson is talking about, which I agree with, is to run single-payer advocates as candidates, people who will boldly say, I'm not going to take any money from corporations, pharmaceutical or any other corporations, and I'm going to fight for single-payer healthcare. Join me. I'm completely out of time, so we won't be able to... I just got the 1-minute card, so I have to respect that. It's 5 minutes ago. Well, let me just quickly talk about, you know, we're correctly saying that, you know, the United States has shamefully lagged behind other industrialized countries. There is no question about that. The healthcare systems, the healthcare delivery and access in many European countries and other countries like South Korea that was mentioned has been remarkably better. But I think that we also have to remember that as a fallout of this devastating recession, global recession, caused by the big banks and the hedge fund owners, has unleashed an unmitigated wave of austerity all over Europe. And one of the casualties of this process has been all the social programs that labor movements and workers' movements fought for in the past. I mean, European countries did not get healthcare systems, obviously, because their capitalist class is nicer than our capitalist class. They got it because, for a combination of reasons, the trajectory of social movements has been different, and they were capable of winning those gains. You know, they were capable of winning those concessions from the ruling class there. But what has been happening in Europe in the last 5 years is also a demonstration of why, even though we should be fighting tooth and nail for single-payer healthcare in this country, we should be well aware that every reform we fight for can be taken back from us as long as we accept the logic of this economic system, which is capitalism. So let's also have a broader and a more fundamental conversation about systemic change.